Greetings YouTube and welcome to the Blue Corner and to a Cardfight Vanguard deck profile for Overdress format. I finally finished my decks so I can do a couple videos on what I have built, and I figured if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this right and start off with the deck that, aesthetically speaking, fits in with the way that this channel has been over the past years. Given that I am a kind of a Narukami stan, I figure it's only right that I do the Narukami inspired deck as my first Overdress profile, which is Eugene, everyone's favorite punching bag, and for good reason, as this deck is in fact quite terrible. But even still, I do have a guilty pleasure soft spot for this guy because, yeah, it's awful, but it also looks like Naru's, and it kind of plays like Naru's, and a little bit like Kagero, and kind of like Murakumo. Like, it definitely is more like of the classic Dragon Empire than, say, Nirvana, which is a different kind of playstyle. But yeah, here we are, Eugene. So why is this deck so constantly shat upon? Because yeah, this is easily the worst deck in the format, and I don't see that changing when the next set drops either. Even though this deck does improve when the next set drops, everything else improves too. So it's literally just no changes. So why is this deck so terrible? Well, the issue with Eugene, he's got a couple of them. As a card itself, he's actually pretty good, and I'll talk about that when I get into the nitty-gritty of the profile. But basically, this is a 3-attack deck that's outclassed by many other 3-attack decks. Particularly, you've got Zorga, Orphis, and Nirvana. And secondly, your rear guards are just not that good quality. Like, when you look at the cards that this deck has, and you look at the cards that Nirvana has, you can tell that there's quite a jump in like power and just overall quality. And yeah, that's really it. Like, also this deck's gimmick can be played around. There's a deck out there that just flat out shits on this, looking at you, Bastion, and Fosato. And yeah, like, this deck can't hit numbers. It doesn't really build advantage that well, and is just outclassed by other stuff. Like, the reason why people would play this deck right now is, one, for the memes, two, because it's cheap. Like, Eugene, even though he's seen a price spike because of meme buyouts, he's still actually one of the cheapest cards, especially triple rares in the set. So it doesn't cost a whole lot to build Eugene. Like, the most expensive card singly in this deck is the Over Trigger. Which amount? This guy, like, this guy costs pretty much almost as much of a playset as Eugene. So yeah. So that being said, though, if you're going to play Eugene, you do need to understand you're going to be fighting an uphill battle against the better decks, just because they can do, basically, you have to jump through hoops to do what they can do for very little effort. So it's like, this deck is, quote, struggle street. Like, this is RU tier deck compared to going up against OU tier decks. And that's kind of all I can really say. Like, we'll talk about, like, when you see how the deck is, you can tell that the units in here are really just not that great, and this deck is being held back quite a bit. So let's talk about the deck itself. So first up, we got the ride line. You got your D-Series starter. You got Nigel, who, when he's rode upon by this guy, you get the Soul Charge 1, the non-rearguard circle. When your opponent's rearguard is retired by your ability, you can counterblast 1, retire him to choose another one of your opponent's rearguards and retire it. This should have gone into Soul for that effect. Like, this is a deck whose main power play is a Soul Blast 5, and you really only get to do that guaranteed once a game, maybe twice if you're able to get, depending on how things go. But like, this should have gone into the Soul. And this guy's ability, when he attacks, you can counterblast 1 to Soul Charge 1 and get 5k if your opponent has 2 or less rear guards. I'm only playing the one of this because, really, as far as being a beater goes, there's just better ones in this deck. And on Vanguard Circle, when Eugene rides upon him, you get to put a card from your drop zone into your Soul to draw 1. That's actually pretty okay, and that's why it's still in here. But I wouldn't be surprised if like a better ride line comes up in due time that just makes me want to geek these guys out. Like, I'm actually considering playing Bar and Hollow in here, just because Bar searches out a grade 1. And then finally, you got Eugene himself. So as a card, he's pretty okay. Like, his first skill is once per turn, tap 2, choose one of your opponent's rear guards, retire it, and then he gets 10k, which is nice. Like, he can go for 23 by himself, so he hits numbers. And then you can tap guys that get themselves off the boards, and then you use the skill, which is once per turn. If you've retired an opponent's rearguard during your turn, you can Soul Blast 5 in order to look at the same number of cards on the top of your deck as the number of your opponent's open rearguard circles, and then call any number of unit cards from among them to rearguard circle, and then put the rest into your soul. So if you're in a scenario like, knowing my luck, you'll see 5 cards, but 4 of them are triggers. You can call the one normal unit and then put the rest into your soul, and then use Eugene again on the following turn. Like, that's what I expect to be the majority of my games to be, is mostly triggers and orders. But yeah, basically Eugene has the potential to call a full board. It just comes down to how much you're able to retire, and if you were able to retire to begin with. Because if your opponent doesn't have a board, you can't retire, therefore you can't use the skill, which is an issue. Or if your opponent has a full board and you don't have a lot of retire options on you, you won't be able to call the full board. And even then though, are you really benefiting that much, where if you have to say use call cards down from your hand just to clear their board out? It's kind of a wash in that scenario. And the other issue with this card is that your units right now are just not that overly powerful. Like, you're a 3 attacks deck, and you can barely hit good numbers. Like, your numbers are lacking compared to what Zorga and Orphis can put out. But Eugene itself is pretty good, and in time, this could get better. Like, if we have better cards that benefit from being rested, like the Brachio that's coming up, then hey, this could get somewhere. And for the rest of the deck, 4 more copies of Eugene, because this deck needs to Persona Ride to hit good numbers. Then running out the Great 3s, 4 copies of Tribash. So when your Vanguard attacks and your opponent has 2 or less rearguards, you can put them into the soul to give it a critical. More cards like this would be a huge godsend for this deck. Like, if Nigel did this, then we'd have something here, because this giving Eugene crit pressure is really nice. Like, Eugene's already going to be 23 most of the time, so 23 crit 2, that forces your opponent to actually guard. Then, starting on the Grade 2s, 4 copies of this Murakuma looking dude. I cannot read this upside down. Oshi-kun, yep. This is why I never played Murakuma and Nubatama. Their names are stupid. Anyway, so this guy's effect is when he attacks and your opponent has 2 or less rearguards, he gets 5k. So it's literally just the Grade 2 in the ride chain, but better, because you don't need to counterblast for this. And I like that. Like, granted, this deck isn't counterblast heavy. I've even considered playing Sunlight Punishment, but I still like to save my counterblasts where I can. Then 3 copies of this guy. So Drag Ritter Alwarith? No. The names, I swear. So when placed, you can counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1 to choose one of your opponent's Grade 2 or greater rearguards and retire it, which is good for getting rid of annoying intercepts and Grade 3s in the back row, looking at you, Bastion, and whatnot. But obviously, Fasado kind of gets around this. But yeah, it's spot removal. It helps you build up towards Eugene's effect. Yes, he does eat up a soul, but my reasoning is that with Eugene and like the way this deck plays, you actually get to about 6 soul before you do the big play, so you'll be able to spare 1 for this guy. And depending on what you see off of Eugene, you're going to partially refund that Soul Blast cost anyway. So this is just a way to help clear up the board so that it takes less work on your part to get that payoff for Eugene. And then rounding out the 2s, I'm playing 3 copies of the 15k shield order. If you're at 3 or more damage, you choose one of your units, it's 15k. So yeah, defensive options are nice. Then for the Grade 1s, 4 copies of the Rare Perfect Guard. Then 4 copies of the Murakuma looking girl, Shiga Manago. Yikes. So her skill is when your opponent's rearguard is retired by your effect during your turn, during a main phase, you can retire her, look at the top card of your deck, and if it's a unit card, call it, or otherwise put it into your soul. So she just, you tap it, much like with Nigel here, and then they both replace themselves. This guy takes another card away from your opponent. This helps you build your board. Again, though, she should have gone into the soul to help facilitate and maintain Eugene's ability to do his skill. But for the time being, they're there. Then rounding out 2 copies of the 10k booster. This, by all accounts, should be Tench's dead since this deck doesn't counterblast enough so you can actually afford to use it, but I don't see Tench's dead making the cut in set 2, so I didn't want to go to the trouble of grabbing a double rare that I'm not even going to play in both of my Dragon Empire decks. So, yeah, I'm playing this guy instead. Admittedly, this could also be Sunlight Punishment, but I like being able to have a 10k booster because this deck, again, struggles to hit numbers, so being able to ramp up my guys is pretty nice. Then for the triggers, I'm playing a pretty basic lineup. 8 crits, 3 draws, 4 heals, and the overtrigger, because even though it's not the most impressive of overtriggers, it's still an overtrigger, so you play them because they can turn games around. I'm not gonna go into the whole debate on overtriggers whether they should be banned or not, because they're not going to ban them. They're a part of the gameplay, so I don't see Bushiroad just suddenly turning their back on these things. Could be wrong, and if they do, then oh well. But for the time being, as long as they're legal, I'm going to play them, because if I'm not, I'm at a disadvantage against the players who do have overtriggers. And that's that. So that's pretty much it for the deck in a nutshell. Like I said, there's not a whole lot going for at the time being. Your 3 attacks, you do have field removal, which is more than what Nirvana can put out, as aside from playing basic arena, it doesn't really retire. And I think this deck has the most amount of removal in the format, aside from Control Bastion, since that can tuck a column. But yeah, aside from that, yeah, it's kind of just outclassed by better decks, like the majority of them. But there are some decks where you, surprisingly enough, just have a good time against. Like, this deck, I believe, has a really good Prison matchup, and ironically enough, I think this deck has a pretty good time going into Nirvana as well, since you can just pop the Valientes and not have to worry about beating them over, and that kind of is a move. But mind you, that deck draws a ton, so if you here or there, so. But yeah, this deck can only go up, and I'm curious to see what happens with this after set 2, but especially after set 3. And yeah, that's all I gotta say. So comment down below on what you're doing with your Eugene profile. I'm sure I'm gonna get a couple of people who are gonna be like, Eugene's actually not that bad, it's topped a couple tournaments once. But yes, just because it's topped 1 or 2 tournaments though doesn't mean it's suddenly a really good deck. Even bad decks will get their tops now and then. And that's all I gotta say about that. So until next time, this is BlueStar899 jacking out.